Hello, friends, and welcome to the introductory episode of a special weekly witness series introducing Texas Impact's legislative priorities for the next biennium. My name is Scott Atdip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we're really looking forward to this series as we welcome Texas Impact staff and faith leaders to introduce you to a set of legislative priorities that we hope will inform the advocacy work of Texans of Faith for the next 2 years. First, for those who are less familiar with our organization, the Texas Impact Board of Directors has about 50 members. They serve as delegates, appointed by our member denominations and faith traditions to represent the social teachings and policy positions of those appointing bodies. And in the summers of even-numbered years, the board members convene to develop a consensus policy agenda and set of legislative priorities. Those priorities guide our work during the Texas legislative sessions that begin in January of odd-numbered years. It's a remarkable process to watch, as representatives of diverse faith backgrounds study their own tradition social statements and consider the most pressing issues facing our state. And when the board met in July to develop their 2023 legislative priorities, there was certainly plenty for them to consider. We'll spend the next 10 or so weeks taking a deeper dive into the full set of legislative priorities, which you can find online at texasimpact.org. But to summarize briefly before we jump in, Texas Impact's legislative priorities fall into 4 big categories: economic justice, climate justice, civic engagement, and human rights. Under those headings, we'll be prioritizing some hot-button issues like reproductive justice and gun control. We're maintaining our longstanding support for public schools and urging climate action, and we're looking at ways we can strengthen our democratic systems. Obviously, faith communities care about a wide range of issues, but we believe the issues the Texas Impact Board has identified will be live issues in the upcoming legislative session and important for Texans of Faith to speak to. So I hope you'll tune in for the series and invite your friends to listen along and consider these priorities. Today, we're going to be joined by 3 of your favorite guests to set the stage for the upcoming series.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
As mentioned in the open, today we are kicking off a series introducing Texas Impact's legislative priorities, and here to help us understand that process and why it's important are, I feel safe saying this, the world's 3 leading experts on the topic. With us today, we have Texas Impact's Executive Director, B. Moorhead. B, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Joshua Houston, Texas Impact's Advocacy Director. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Scott.
And last but not least, Beaman Floyd, President of the Texas Impact Foundation and Legislative Consultants. Beaman, thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Hey, Scott. Great to be here.
All right. So I won't talk about the heat. Josh doesn't want to do any banter. We're just going to jump on in today. No talk about feelings. So B, I'll start with you, and you're welcome to talk about your feelings if you want. But you have been Texas Impact's Executive Director since, I think, 2000. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. And you've worked with the board over those years to set about a dozen of these biennial legislative agendas. So first of all, talk to us about why that process is important, but also how is it different this time?
Well, it's important because the Texas Impact Board represents all these different religious bodies, and each of those religious bodies individually has some priorities that they are more or less interested in year to year. But the Texas Impact legislative priorities are a consensus of all of those priorities, all the issue priorities of all the faith communities that participate pulled together. So it's a challenging process in the best of times for the board to get together and, kind of parse through all of the different policy issues faith communities care about, all of the different things that are going on in our state. What's in the news sometimes can change a lot between the time when they're making the agenda and the time when the legislature starts meeting. So kind of knowing ahead of time how you want to handle things that could come up. All of that is a pretty complicated process. This time around, it was made much more complicated by the insertion of some hot button topics that historically haven't been on Texas Impact's agenda. So we have two issues that are new to the legislative agenda this session for the first time, not just since I've been working for Texas Impact, but since the organization started in 1973. And those two issues are reproductive justice and gun control. In both cases, the board has avoided those issues for 50 years almost. One, by saying there's not a clear consensus among the mainstream faith communities that participate. So it's not possible to come to clear legislative language about them. And also that there are other issues that are perhaps higher on the agenda for more people in the state. So at different times, issues related to criminal justice or public education or any of the other number of issues we work on have been high on the priorities of all of those faith traditions, all those communities there. And, reproduction and guns, of course, have been priority issues for a long time, but not in that same kind of everybody all at one time way. This year, there aren't any two issues that are more comprehensively affirmed than those two. Everyone is worried about them. Everyone has feelings about them. And so it really wasn't possible for Texas Impact to take a pass. So because of that, the board had to do a lot of pre-work that they don't usually have to do for their legislative agenda. They had to dig into their denominational positions and teachings and engage in a lot of hard conversations. I was super proud of them. They worked really hard, and they came up with a really robust set of priorities.
I agree. And I've had a chance over the years, as you know, to speak to a lot of different groups. And one of the things that surprises people is that all of these different faith traditions can come to consensus. That we can figure out a way to work together, to have hard conversations, and to come to agreement on so many important priorities. And Beaman, you advise many different groups in the work that you do. How is Texas Impact's process different, and why is the process piece of that so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key ingredient is really it's a high quality process that we're dealing in the concept of representative democracy, which means we really have to be representing the interests of our groups. We are responding to that greatest of modern challenges, which is living in a diverse community, but having common policy principles. And instead of going and siloing ourselves, we sit down at the table and really hash it out and figure out what's really important in the context of principles. And I think if you do that, I think it's imperative that you do it, frankly, because you will wind up in the Capitol with a set of policy principles that are cogent, that are well supported, that people are willing to come to the Capitol and represent on their own time, on their own dime, in concert with us. And it creates a much stronger penetration of the community into the Capitol than if you are incomplete or haphazard about that process. We need to be really consistent in our message, no matter who's delivering it and how it's being delivered and when it's being delivered, day or night, or in the newspaper or in a late night committee. It's got to be consistent, and you get that consistency with good process up front.
So, Josh, Beaman talked about taking this into the Capitol, and you're the one who's often charged with taking this set of priorities into the Capitol. Talk to us some about the process as well. Why is that process important, and how is it received inside the building? Why is that important?
Yeah, I think it's received as the word I would use is authentic. Anyone with a computer and a copier can make a legislative agenda, right? And it's a thing that happens so often. There's a term for it called astroturfing. And B talked about the structure of our organization, how our board is appointed to us by our member denominations, and that brings about an authenticity. We're not just picking board members, and the board isn't picking themselves. It's the communities of Texas that they represent that are picking their representation that sits on the board and makes this agenda. So they are sitting there making sure that the legislative agenda reflects the faith traditions that they are a part of and that they represent on the board. And so that not only reflects what the interfaith community of Texas's consensus position is, so that of mainline Protestants, Jews, and Muslims, but the consensus position of those individual faith traditions, which has been derived out through community consensus building as well. So it's a community of communities, you might say, that totals about 4 to 5 million Texans.
One of the lines I use often is when I'm out speaking to groups is clearly not every person in every pew would agree with our legislative priorities, because if your congregation's anything like mine, we can't agree on the carpet color, let alone these hard topics. I wonder if y'all can say anything about how special it is that these diverse faith traditions can come to consensus in a world where that doesn't seem to be the norm right now.
The easy answer to that is, well, because we all affirm this basic idea about loving our neighbor, right? That's the underpinning of all of our faith traditions. And, at Texas Impact, we are for sure disproportionately Abrahamic in the way that we approach our issues. But you don't have to stay in the Abrahamic traditions. That idea of love of neighbor is absolutely universal in the world's faith traditions. So it's easy to sort of stop there and talk about, we all care about the same stuff, so of course we would have the same legislative priorities. I think an issue like abortion brings out what, at a much deeper level, what's so important about that consensus, because it is easy for everyone to say we care about our neighbor. It is a lot harder to say, well, what does that mean when you get to a particularity, an issue that people have our neighbors don't all agree with each other. What is good for one of them may not be good for another one of them. And there, I think what you see is the attention to kind of this. I think Josh was gesturing to the idea, the attention to the iterative wisdom of those traditions, that the mainstream faith communities that participate in Texas Impact are not made up of individual charismatic religious leaders who say a thing that gets a lot of buy-in from a lot of people, but isn't subjected to a lot of rigorous group discussion. The more like a revealed teaching. The faith communities that participate in Texas Impact, by contrast to that model, trade in iterative group discussion. We meet, so Beaman and I are both Presbyterian. Our presbyteries meet 3 times a year and discuss the same issues, often year after year after year, 3 times a year. And, Scott, you're Methodist. You guys talk about the same issues decade after decade after decade.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
But in doing that, in having those iterative conversations, one of the things you allow space for is the members of the tradition to hear each other and change their minds or add to their own knowledge or bring new experience that they may not have had the first time they had this conversation. So what you end up with is a much more fully fleshed out group understanding of the issue, what all of our understandings of our faith traditions have to say about the concepts that are related to the issue. So I'll say one more thing and then I'll pass it on because I know I'm monopolizing. But, the other thing other than, well, we all love our neighbor, so that's why we can have an agreement is, well, because the tradition, the scripture says we should take care of the poor or take care of the sick. And so it's easy. We just need to follow those teachings. Well, maybe, but Matthew 25, it says we need to visit the sick. It doesn't say they all need to have health insurance. There wasn't any such thing. So iterating in that community conversation is also how we move from the core principle into the present day legislative expression of that principle in our particularity of our Texas Democratic legislative process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think that I would add on to that there's specific, like almost archetypal experiences in all of our faith traditions of all the problems that humanity can face. We were I was in a faith-based discussion at one point about the pandemic early in the process when people were saying, wow, this is really uncertain and we're really afraid and we're not sure what's going to happen. But as a group, we recognized almost humorously, but we've been doing plagues for 2,000 years. Like, we're good at this stuff, right? If there's anybody who knows what to do right now, it's actually us. There may be scientists who know more about the germs than we do, but we know way more about the collective community response to something like this than anybody. And I just think I think when you take the philosophical and faith underpinnings of what we do, the theological underpinnings of what we do, if you put that with the actual practice of what we've been doing year after year, decade after decade, century after century, and if you believe that that's embedded in our community and church and faith community organizational structure, then we really have something to offer. We have a wisdom that transcends the history of Texas or the history of the United States of America, for that matter. And I think that's really part of what we bring to the conversation.
And speaking of those iterative conversations, I want to shift a little bit to the legislative priorities. Since 1973, Texas Impact has had positions on many things where the faith communities agreed. And spoiler, like, not all of those are fixed yet. And if we were to sit down and have a conversation about all of the things that we cared about, that agenda would be super long and we wouldn't have time to work on any of it. And so there are a lot of things we care about that aren't necessarily in this list of priorities that we're going to focus on this coming biennium. And that list might change over time. But starting out, we could have even included many things in the four categories of economic justice, climate justice, civic engagement, and human rights. So Josh, I wonder maybe if you could say a word about those priorities, why it's important to narrow that agenda down to a list of priorities, and if there was anything that surprised you this year.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to define the differences between priorities and positions. I mean, we've had positions since 1973, but not everything's a live thing. You can't possibly work everything all the time. There's not enough resources or time in the day or whatever have you. A payload, I think, is a way we've talked about it before as well. So you have to prioritize. And I think the board did a very good job of this, making those distinctions between positions they took on an issue in the 1980s that is not a live legislative issue. They can let that kind of go a little bit and not put it on the list, and making sure that the list is contained to actionable things for which we as citizens of a democracy can then look at the end of in June of 2023 and say, well, how'd they do? And actually, they will have had opportunities to actually do something on those things or not do something on those things. And then we can do our part as citizens going into the 2024 primaries and act accordingly.
Can I just add to that? I think there is something about the issues being live and something about how urgent they are. So, this morning I was talking with a colleague about some issues related to workers and particularly, laborers and how they need water breaks and they need humane conditions to work in. That's an issue that Texas Impact has a position on. We support. It's something that's not on this list of priorities, though. And that's because there are so many specific issues that come down the pike that are things that we affirm but are not at the level of urgency and universality where we think we can get the whole Texas Impact membership lined up and pushing on them at one time. And so part of our job also, in addition to having our own set of legislative priorities, is to be aware of the priorities that other colleague organizations, partner organizations have, and know how we can be supportive when we're able, when we have bandwidth, understand what our members may be working on when they're not working on issues with us, but to understand that our particular role in this process is to be kind of the highest level of consensus urgency, I guess. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that part of what we do is, when you work in the legislative session, there's this, what I consider to be a false dichotomy of proactive and reactive. Kind of everything's reactive, right? Where even when we have a bill, that we are real serious about and we help draft and we want to pass, all the common wisdom is, oh, well, that's proactive, but we're reacting to something, right? We're reacting to a need. And I think what's great about Texas Impact being 50 years old, and yes, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary during the next legislative session, is that it's just this giant sedimentary pile of good, consistent, high-quality development of a legislative agenda that has created a general culture that we can run any bill through that comes up. Like, there's kind of not a thing that somebody can think of to file as a bill that we can't set against the culture of this organization and have a high level of confidence what our people think. And that's got a huge, the 50 years is not just, we get to eat cake. It's really got an enormous value for us in our ability to move quickly and surely in the legislative process because we really, really understand our community well.
To be clear, though, we will get to eat cake, right?
Oh, certainly cake.
Okay, I just want to make sure. And so to add to that, there have certainly been times over the course of, even my time here where 140 days moves fast, and there could be things that pop up that we do have to respond to that aren't on the list of legislative priorities, right?
There always are. Every time.
You say that, Scott, about even in your time here. I had only had this job for 2 years when I got my very first intern, Scott Atnip, my intrepid LBJ school student. And in a lot of ways, you have helped to create the consensus culture that we use for a lot of those discussions. I mean, we do a lot of going around the state talking to people and hearing what the people in San Angelo or Beeville or Denton have to say. And, it is a labor-intensive thing, but I think that's partly why we feel so solid about our agenda, because when the board votes on it, we can say, oh, yeah, we know.
Yes, we have seen a lot of Texas over the years, and friends will be coming to see you soon. So keep an eye on texasimpact.org for announcements. B, you mentioned a couple of times, I wonder if anybody else wants to weigh in, but I think that the news coming out of this legislative list, this set of legislative priorities is going to be that Texas Impact is taking a position and working on issues that we haven't worked on in the first 49 years. And you mentioned reproductive health and issues related to guns. Anybody else want to add to that piece of the conversation?
Actually, I'll say those two issues are the ones that we've never worked on before this time. But when I first started working here, the issue we'd never worked on that the board was very nervous about taking any position on was climate change. Very divisive issue. And today, you could turn to any news channel in the country and he'll hear climate change as just a fact. There's not debate about whether it's happening. But when I started this job, it was not that way at all. Later, we had never said anything about water. And once upon a time, we had to do a big study on water to identify whether water was a serious concern for faith communities. We determined that it was. And then in 2017, we had a change on LGBT issues, Josh, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that kind of actually started in 2013 when we started venturing. Well, I guess we had always had a position on religious liberty, but we hadn't really taken the lead on it as the state's interfaith organization because we had some colleagues that are no longer quite the leaders they used to be. But it was necessary for the interfaith community to have a position on religious liberty as it was being talked about so one-sidedly in the press. And we had to remind the country and the state and state leaders what it really is. And then that began our work that ventured us down the road into 2017 when it was the bathroom bill. And we had to take a position kind of quickly and got the board together to do so, to be able to respond to that unpredictable thing that the board had not foreseen. It was unforeseeable, frankly, prior to that session when they made their agenda. So, yeah, we've been through not just, less well, water's pretty controversial, too, if you really get into it at a local level. But things that you think of as the hot button things that divide churches, we've been down this road before, and we've handled it, and, we will again.
Yeah, I think that raises a qualitative concept in this organization is that you have to be pretty intentional about being venerable, right? About being an organization that has this sort of long-standing credibility and also spry. How can you be so well, really well grounded and also really flexible in public affairs? And I got to tell you, you asked me at the very beginning, Scott, about my work with other organizations. This is a rare quality. This ability to basically be really structurally rooted and also be flexible and spry enough to respond to the issues of the day.
And we know from our hymn tradition in the Presbyterian Church that once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide, and new occasions teach new duties. So we understand that the circumstances are constantly changing, and that exactly what Beaman said is what we have to do. We have to be able to stay rooted in our principles, but ready to move very quickly into areas that we hadn't expected to. We had not expected. Nobody woke up in January of 2022 thinking this was the legislative agenda we were going to have in July.
All right, friends. So here's the deal. If you tuned in today hoping that we would do a deep dive on each one of the issues and the legislative priorities, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we will spend the next 10 weeks doing just that. And so each of these three panelists that we have with us today will be back for a couple of episodes, along with some faith leaders, denominational leaders from throughout the country. And so we hope you'll tune in for the next 10 weeks. But the question I think I want to leave with us today is, what do you hope people will do with these legislative priorities? What's the goal? We're not just going to publish them on our website and do a podcast series. What do you hope listeners will do with these priorities?
Yeah, be active. Talk to your legislators. Talk to the other people in your community. Take some action. One of the oddest things that has happened in my legislative experience over the past 10 or 20 years has been, it used to be that you would go in and say, look, I'm representing this point of view, and people would say, okay. And now you go in and say, I'm representing this point of view, and people say, prove it. And what we need is for the members of Texas Impact to say, yeah, that is what we think, and do that with their presence and with communication and with willingness to engage their legislators in their home districts.
So in November, we're going to have an election. The future of the legislative agenda, frankly, is dependent on the outcome of that election. I mean, everyone is, but it's still true. And then they will come in January. Whoever the people elect will come, and they will govern. And throughout that process of 140 days, I hope that people will pay attention, because voting is essential. and voting is a bare minimum. You have to be active and engaged all year round. And if you are paying attention through the legislative session, the 140 days, then we hope people will take stock of what they did and they didn't do and repeat that cycle. There will be a primary in 2024 where they will get to make choices. There will most certainly be some sort of runoff somewhere that's part of that primary. There will be local elections in May, and then there will be general elections again in November. And we do that over and over and over again, God willing, because we're a democracy.
Well, I think pay attention, stay involved. Those are the right things. I will add to that one other, which is make sure your faith tradition is paying attention. So we all have social statements. All of our faith traditions have, these core tenets that about how we believe people should be in the world, and that's what feeds into our legislative agenda. Well, now that we have those legislative priorities, very helpful for the faith communities in the state to look at those priorities and understand how they are related to their faith tradition. So if you are, a mainline Protestant, a Jewish community, a Muslim community, these legislative priorities are a great avenue for you back into your tradition to study how it is that we move between the current events that we're living in and the timeless teachings that ground us.
I'll add, y'all, this is friend-making time. This is the time where you need to bring these legislative priorities and start conversations with your Sunday school class or equivalents, your small groups, your friends in the community, and start to have conversations as we head into November and head into January. I'll give a shout out today to one of our board members, Reverend Randy Smith. We were in a meeting and he just kept bringing up the Texas Impact legislative priorities and sending people to the website and encouraging people to listen to the podcast. So, hey, friends that Randy sent, I'm glad you're listening today. But be that guy, be that person who brings these up and starts to have conversations in your communities. The point of these legislative priorities is to engage people of faith throughout Texas, to have conversations with each other, and then schedule time to go visit with your legislators about them. So that's our homework for this week. Any closing thoughts, friends, before we close out today?
I don't have any closing except to say, Scott, that we're so grateful for the work that you do to illuminate these issues and to illuminate our work and make it be that people can get access to it through this podcast.
Well, that is kind. I appreciate the world's 3 leading experts on the Texas Impact legislative priorities and really appreciate y'all taking the time today.
Thank you as usual, man. Thanks. Appreciate
it, y'all. Friends, this is just the beginning of a series that will be focusing on Texas Impact legislative priorities, so make sure that you and your friends are tuning in the weeks to come. I want to thank our guests today, B. Moorhead, Josh Houston, and Beaman Floyd. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. And I hope that you'll plan on tuning in and sharing this series with your friends and networks. We're excited about the guests we have joining us and the content we'll be covering in the coming weeks. And I really hope you enjoy the series, but to be honest, enjoyment is not the real goal. The goal is to equip you with the tools to understand important priorities so you can talk with your friends, family, congregation, networks, and elected representative. Y'all, this is an important time for Texas, and I don't say this lightly. This might be the most important time in recent memory for Texans of faith and good conscience to engage in the policy realm. And we hope Weekly Witness is a tool for you to engage in a meaningful way. If you have questions or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And leave us a rating or review and leave a comment for us in the feed. We want to hear from you, and we want even more people to find us. So work that algorithm with your likes, shares, retweets, subscriptions, comments, and more. All right, y'all, I think that's about enough Weekly Witness for this week, so we will catch you next week with the next episode in the series. Between now and then, make sure you've subscribed to the podcast and check to make sure you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact at texasimpact.org, and make sure you've subscribed to all of our social media feeds so that you can keep up to date on upcoming events like Texas Impact's Faith and Democracy series. Friends, summer break is about over. So now's the time to plug back in. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.